In the volatile heart of the Middle East, a chain of events has unfolded that could reshape global alliances forever. Just days ago, the world watched as tensions between Iran, Israel, and the United States escalated into open conflict. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed in a joint U.S.-Israeli airstrike, sparking immediate retaliation from Tehran. Now, reports confirm Iran has launched its sixth wave of ballistic missile and drone strikes, not only targeting Israeli military sites, but also putting 27 American bases across the region squarely in their crosshairs. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGCs, has vowed this is just the beginning of what they call the most ferocious offensive in their history. Explosions have echoed from Tel Aviv to the Persian Gulf, with air raid sirens blaring and interceptors lighting up the night sky. But why now? And what does this mean for the fragile balance of power? This isn't just another skirmish. It's a potential tipping point that could draw in superpowers and disrupt everything from oil prices to international security. Stick around as we break it down step by step, because the stakes have never been higher. And that's where the real questions begin. Let's rewind to understand how we got here. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel initiated a coordinated military operation, dubbed Operation Epic Fury by some sources, or Operation Roaring Lion, according to Israeli statements. This assault targeted key Iranian regime figures and military installations, including those linked to nuclear and ballistic missile programs. The most shocking outcome, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was confirmed dead in the strikes, as reported by Iranian state media and international outlets. This marked a dramatic escalation following months of heightened rhetoric in prior confrontations, like Israel's earlier air campaign against Iran in June of the previous year. Iran's response was swift and multifaceted. Under the banner of Operation True Promise 4, the IRGC unleashed waves of attacks. By March 1st, they had reached the sixth wave involving hundreds of missiles and drones. Targets included Israel's Tel Nof Air Base, military headquarters, and a major defense complex in Tel Aviv. But the strikes didn't stop there. 27 U.S. military locations in countries like Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq were also hit. Iranian state television broadcasted claims of these operations, framing them as self-defense against unprovoked aggression. On the ground, the impacts are already visible. In Israel, one woman was killed and over 120 others injured, mostly minor, from the incoming barges. Israel retaliated with its own strikes, hitting more than 30 targets in western and central Iran, including air defense systems and ballistic missile arrays in Tehran itself. Meanwhile, U.S. officials report no American casualties so far, with many projectiles intercepted. Pro-Iranian militias in Iraq have also threatened further attacks on U.S. bases. The European Union has called for maximum restraint, highlighting the risk of a wider regional war. Here's the problem. These exchanges aren't isolated. They've triggered explosions in Gulf cities and put entire populations on edge. Oil markets are jittery with potential disruptions to shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf. But this timeline raises deeper questions about the motivations behind these moves. And that's where things start getting complicated. Beneath the smoke and sirens lies a web of strategic calculations. For Israel, these strikes represent a preemptive effort to neutralize Iran's growing threats. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has long viewed Iran's nuclear ambitions and support for proxy groups like Hezbollah as existential dangers. By targeting leadership and missile capabilities, Israel aims to degrade Iran's ability to project power, especially after previous conflicts exposed vulnerabilities into Iran's defenses. Experts suggest this could be part of a broader doctrine to prevent Iran from achieving nuclear breakout, drawing parallels to Israel's past operations against regional adversaries. The U.S. involvement adds another layer under President Trump's administration. Wait, sources indicate ongoing U.S. leadership in this context. The strikes align with policies to counter Iranian influence in the Middle East. Targeting 27 bases signals Iran's intent to deter American intervention, exploiting the presence of U.S. troops in allied nations to raise the costs of escalation. Analysts discuss how this could force Washington to reassess its commitments, potentially straining alliances with Gulf states who host these facilities. Iran's strategy might also aim to rally domestic support amid internal unrest, portraying the regime as a defender against foreign aggression. But there's a catch. Retaliation risks miscalculation. Iran's use of proxies like the Iraqi Hezbollah brigades threatening U.S. assets could widen the conflict to involve non-state actors. For the U.S. and Israel, the goal appears to be regime weakening without full invasion. But experts warn this could backfire, unifying Iran's fractured society or prompting asymmetric responses like cyber attacks or oil tanker disruptions. Who benefits? Israel and the U.S. might gain short-term security gains, but Iran could leverage this to strengthen ties with Russia or China, altering geopolitical dynamics. At risk are civilians in the crossfire and global energy supplies with the Strait of Hormuz, a potential flashpoint. This hidden chess game isn't just about military might, it's about long-term influence. But the real story begins when we look at the ripple effects worldwide. The conflict has already sent shockwaves far beyond the Middle East. Oil prices surged more than 15% in the first hours of escalation, as traders priced in risks to the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply passes. Disruptions to shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf have forced rerouting of tankers, driving up freight costs and threatening energy security for Europe and Asia. Major airports in Dubai, Doha, and other Gulf hubs suspended operations temporarily amid drone and missile threats, stranding thousands of travelers and halting regional commerce. Economically, the impacts compound quickly. Stock markets in Europe and Asia dipped sharply, with energy stocks gaining but broader indices reflecting fears of prolonged instability. Gulf states hosting U.S. bases, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, face direct exposure. Their economies, heavily reliant on stable energy exports and foreign investment, now grapple with damaged infrastructure and heightened insurance premiums. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, despite not directly participating in the initial strikes, have seen their territories affected by Iranian projectiles, complicating their delicate balancing act between U.S. alliances and regional de-escalation efforts. On the diplomatic front, the United Nations Security Council held an emergency session, but divisions run deep. Russia and China condemned the U.S.-Israeli operation as aggression, while Western allies urged restraint without endorsing regime change rhetoric. The European Union issued statements calling for de-escalation, emphasizing civilian protection and the need to avoid a wider war. Iran's Interim Leadership Council, hastily formed after Qam's death, has signaled continuity in hardline policy, potentially complicating any back-channel talks. Here's the problem. Proxy forces add unpredictable layers. Iran-backed groups in Iraq have mobilized, threatening U.S. positions, while militias elsewhere could activate sleeper cells or cyber attacks. This raises the specter of asymmetric warfare, spreading to shipping, energy infrastructure, or even cyber domains, affecting global supply chains. Who benefits in this chaos? Short-term, perhaps actors seeking to reshape alliances. Russia gains leverage in energy markets. China eyes opportunities in a distracted West. But the risks are immense. Civilians bear the brunt, from injuries in Israel to potential shortages elsewhere. Energy-dependent nations face inflation pressures, and migration flows could accelerate if the conflict drags on. The equation has shifted dramatically, pulling in economic and diplomatic threads that touch every continent. Yet even this fallout pales compared to what might unfold if escalation continues unchecked. Analysts outline several plausible paths forward, none of them reassuring. In the near term, Iran may intensify its missile barges, drawing on its arsenal of thousands of ballistic projectiles to overwhelm defenses. Reports suggest the IRGC views this as a multi-phase campaign, with future waves potentially incorporating more advanced hypersonic systems or coordinated proxy actions. Israel, backed by U.S. support, could respond with deeper strikes targeting remaining nuclear sites, command centers, or even leadership figures to degrade capabilities further. A key variable is U.S. involvement. With bases under fire and carriers like the USS Abraham Lincoln reportedly targeted, Washington faces pressure to retaliate directly. Experts discuss scenarios where additional carrier strike groups reinforce the region or where airstrikes expand to hit Iranian oil facilities, risking severe supply shocks. President Trump's administration has signaled resolve, but domestic debates over war powers could constrain options if casualties mount. De-escalation remains possible, though slim. Back-channel communications via Oman or Qatar might emerge with incentives, like sanctions relief or nuclear talks. Iran's interim council could seek to stabilize domestically by claiming victories and pausing attacks, especially if internal unrest grows amid economic strain. International mediators, including the UN or European powers, may push for a ceasefire tied to confidence-building measures. But there's a catch. Miscalculation looms large. A stray missile causing mass casualties, a successful strike on a major U.S. asset, or proxy escalation in Lebanon or Yemen could force hands. Worst-case projections include a prolonged air war, cyber retaliation disrupting global networks, or even limited ground incursions if proxies overrun borders. Who stands to gain or lose? Israel may secure temporary deterrence against Iranian threats, but at the cost of sustained regional hostility. The U.S. risks overextension, straining resources and alliances. Iran could rally nationalist support, but faces regime fragility without common. Gulf states caught in the middle prioritize stability above all. The coming days will likely determine whether this remains a contained exchange or spirals into something far broader. The choices made now, restraint or escalation, will echo for years. And that brings us to the deeper forces shaping this moment. This confrontation didn't emerge in a vacuum. It's the culmination of decades-long rivalries. Iran's 1979 revolution set the stage for ideological opposition to Israel and the U.S., fueling proxy networks across the region. Israel's security doctrine has long prioritized preventing hostile states from acquiring nuclear weapons or advanced missiles, leading to preemptive actions like the 1981 Iraq strike and more recent operations. The 2024-2025 exchanges, including direct missile barges and a 12-day war, eroded red lines. U.S. policy under successive administrations has oscillated between containment and confrontation, with the current strikes reflecting a view that Iran's nuclear threshold and regional influence had become intolerable. Cam's death removes a central figure who balanced hardliners and pragmatists, potentially unleashing internal power struggles or more aggressive successors. Geopolitically, this tests the post-Cold War order. It highlights the limits of deterrence when asymmetric tools proliferate: drones, missiles, proxies. It also underscores shifting alliances. Gulf states' quiet normalization with Israel contrasts with Iran's axis of resistance. Russia's support for Thrawn and China's economic ties add great power dimensions, potentially complicating any resolution. Long-term outcomes hinge on whether this leads to regime change in Iran, a negotiated freeze on its programs, or entrenched stalemate. A weakened Iran might reduce proxy threats, but could breed instability, empowering extremists. A strengthened hardline faction risks perpetual conflict. The human cost remains stark: civilian deaths, displaced populations, economic hardship. Yet amid the tension lies a narrow window for diplomacy if cooler heads prevail. In the end, this episode reminds us how interconnected our world has become. A strike in Thrawn ripples to oil pumps in Houston, markets in Tokyo, and streets in Europe. The bigger picture isn't just about two nations or even a region. It's about whether major powers can manage escalation in an era of precision weapons and fragile trust. The path ahead remains uncertain, but the lessons from these days will shape global security for a generation.